Welcome to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the museum's curator of collections.
So in this very special Halloween podcast, we're talking about spooky rural history with Mark Norman.
So Mark is a former colleague of mine from the Council of the Folklore Society, which is a UK organisation dedicated to the study of folklore. And folklore, as Mark will go on to describe, is sometimes characterised as a form of intangible cultural heritage. So here in the museum, we look after lots of tangible heritage, so material objects, artefacts, and collections of that kind. We look after archives, physical paper archives, tangible stuff. The study of folklore is often about the things that fall in the gaps between. So there is a UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage from 2003, and that divides folklore up into 5 different domains. One is oral traditions, another is performing arts, there are social practices and rituals and events, and Mark will go on to talk about calendar customs.
I thought you were going to say like ghosts, monsters, zombies.
Well, they'd be like subcategories, wouldn't they?
Subcategories, yeah.
I mean, whether they're performing arts or oral traditions, I don't know. It depends whether you're dressing up or telling me a ghost story, I guess. But the ones that cross over most strongly, I guess, with the museum are knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe. And I think probably farming fits somewhere into that, and knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts, which are the 2 big sides of what we hold here at the Merle. So I guess this conversation with Mark, as well as being spooky and Halloweeny, is also beginning to pick up on stuff that we don't necessarily have in the Museum of English Rural Life. So it's really nice to be stepping into that space too.
As well as spooky objects that have many rural links. So, thinking of besom broomsticks, pumpkins, carved turnips, things like that. We also talk about one of our very keen interests, Scooby Doo.
Scooby Doo.
Which Mark has written a book about before. So, yeah, come for rural history, stay for the shenanigans of the Mystery Machine.
Yeah, and Mark's written various books, so he's very prolific in terms of his publications, and lots of those are relevant here, so that's great.
Yeah. Enjoy. Welcome to Absolute Units, Mark. It's brilliant to have you with us.
Hello.
Thank you for coming, Mark.
It's my pleasure. I didn't have to come very far.
Obviously, Mark, it's great to have you with us. You and I have known each other for quite a few years now through our connection with the Folklore Society, in which you're still a council member, I believe.
I am still a council member. They haven't thrown me off just yet.
Yeah, so I've segued off that committee, but we keep in touch because obviously the world in which you work in folklore studies and library and archive work around that area overlaps very strongly with the world in which Joe and I work, sort of museums of rural life emerging from that folklife studies tradition. We're going to get onto those kinds of things, histories of collecting and how these worlds intersect in a future episode, and hopefully that'll enable us to talk about some of those amazing institutions that you've been involved in founding and leading. But I thought it's Halloween. We're thinking about things folksy. It's a great time of year for thinking about seasonal customs and calendar customs. I wondered whether we could start with you giving us a sense of your knowledge of Halloween, seasonal events. Why do we do these things? Where do they come from? What are the key British customs, and how are those changing?
I think Halloween is one of those examples of why working with folklore is such a great topic area, because nobody really knows where half of the things come from. And in terms of folklore, that's okay. In any other discipline, if you can't put your finger on an origin story or on a reason for something happening, people will criticize you for shoddy work. But in terms of folklore, it's just all there for debate, really. And that's the case with Halloween as well. So when we look at the different aspects of what we do now for Halloween in the 21st century, they all kind of tie in with the older customs. So trick-or-treating is an obvious one, which ties in with guising and with going door-to-door house visiting customs, which we find at other times of the year as well. And obviously the kind of fancy dress comes out of that as well. Pumpkin as we have now, or the turnip or other impossible to carve root vegetables which have been used in the past. That's why at the end of the day we use pumpkins now. They're much easier to scoop out than a turnip, let's be honest.
So did we use turnips originally?
Yeah, and other similar kind of root vegetables. I mean, the pumpkin, of course, comes in with a lot of the Americanization of Halloween and really embeds itself for that reason. You know, you can scoop a pumpkin out with a spoon. You've really got to, spend 3 days with a bandsaw to get through a turnip. But when you look at the old examples of carved turnips as lanterns, which we still have, or at least that we have either facsimiles or casts of, they're much spookier looking, arguably, I would say, than a pumpkin. But that side of it comes out of legend more and tales, the folktale aspect. Ghosts and witches, which are the other big part of Halloween, they kind of come out of different areas. You have to consider with Halloween that it's a festival which has sort of all sorts of different roots. Some of it comes out of Samhain and those kind of ancient holidays, but then other aspects of it come out of the fact that it was All Hallows was more of a church-based festival, which never took place at this time of year at all.
Just to jump in, what was the first holiday you mentioned? Was that Samhain, did you say?
Samhain, yes.
What was that?
It was a festival that marked the end of the harvest period. It was when you would take your crops and store them for the winter. So it's the end of that kind of cycle of birth and death and rebirth that we see throughout the traditional year. And it kind of links it in then with the Feast of the Dead, which we see obviously in other cultures at a similar time of year as well. It was a time when people would remember their ancestors, remember the things that came before. And it feeds into this aspect of this time of year being a liminal time. Is when ghosts and spirits and these other kinds of things could transition from their realm to the human realm in terms of folklore and folk tradition. And that in itself feeds into this idea of guising and dressing up. So you don't want the nasty spirits that are coming from the other side to spot you, so you put yourself into disguise so that they don't know who you are.
This is actually a liminal podcast as well, because we're doing this as an addition to the cadence we normally release at, possibly very fitting for Halloween.
Yeah.
I also just wanted to go back a second and pick up on what you said about folklore being a rare discipline where much of it almost inherently has that kind of untraceable origin. That does seem like a really interesting point of distinction about folklore specifically, that it really, it's lore that comes from the people and it goes back and back and back. In this spooky time of year, there is something almost quite spooky and ethereal about that as well.
It's interesting actually though, because folklore as a discipline of study really only dates back to the mid-19th century. It has its sort of ancestors of its own in terms of antiquarian practice and sort of studies and interested in bygones and things like that prior to that. But the term itself dates to the early to mid-19th century. We've got a very exact moment of origin for folklore itself, I guess. And actually, in those early days, people were very interested in origins. They're trying to trace and track origins, but folklore has evolved and morphed over time into something that's not just about tracing those origins. Often it's about tracking and tracing over very long periods of time, I guess, Mark, isn't it? You can look back to those pre-Christian pagan festivals, seasonal traditions, ways of celebrating moments in the year, connect those through to these Christian and even secular traditions now, of course, as well.
You can, but you have to be very careful in doing that to not make leaps of faith. And there are plenty of people who have done that in the past. Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough is a good example of that. It has a lot of leaps of faith in it. Margaret Murray's work on the European witch cult is a prime example, which is cited now as being mostly discredited, but did a lot of what some people would call damage. But in other ways, it's just part of what folklore is. It's developing, changing narratives over time. So you do need to be slightly careful about saying this is definitely the origin of something or this links to what we do now because, but at the same time, the narratives that we have now all develop out of those changing ideas over time. That's why folklore is such a good discipline. I mean, people refer to aspects within folklore, like paranormal aspects, for example, where paranormal researchers, paranormal investigators, however they like to style themselves, they're looking at providing answers. This definitely exists because, if you take a ghost, for example, from this time of year, folklore doesn't do that. Folklore doesn't care whether something exists or not in that way. It's a social history. What we care about is why people have experiences, perhaps, or why people tell the stories that they tell. What do those stories tell us about our environment, our surroundings, who we are as people, the groups that we live and operate in, and why do those narratives change and develop over time? And how do they become embedded in other areas of the country, other areas of the world, and take on their own cultural elements from those places as well?
So, Mark, you mentioned James George Frazer, the Golden Bough. James George Frazer is a 19th century anthropologist, and he writes about a vast swathe of different cultures, and it's a sort of composite idea of culture. So he's writing about lots of different places, times, and lots of different cultural communities. And he's trying to do that in a way that encapsulates and explains human experience. But obviously, he's embedded in a time when we're thinking about humans as being quite distinct from each other and different hierarchies of human cultures. So it's embedded in a lot of complex and problematic ways of framing the world. But it also makes these vast and sweeping generalizations. Is that fair, Mark? That's a sort of...
Yes, I mean, a lot of his ideas really feed into what I was saying earlier about this cycle of death and rebirth that Halloween at this time of year is kind of the end of, because Frazer really believed or tried to prove that the ancient religions, or what a lot of people now just kind of broadly term paganism, which is a very difficult catch-all term really to use, that they were all essentially fertility cults. So they had this kind of worship and sacrifice element to them, which fitted in with the whole cycle of the seasons, what then developed in more modern times into what we now like to call the Wheel of the Year.
19th century anthropologists excited about fertility and fecundity. Who would have thought it? And then, of course, you mentioned Margaret Murray as well, who has been largely discredited because of that idea about sort of pan-European witch cults and sort of secret networks of witchcraft. Totally disproven on that front, but did some really interesting things as well. So spinning off from that, early queer activists in the States were inspired by Margaret Murray's work, and it has a sort of legacy of its own. She also collected objects, and most famously in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, there is a so-called witch in a bottle, which turns on its head the idea of witch bottles. Witch bottles are usually protective, but in this particular instance, it's said to have been a witch trapped in a bottle.
What is a witch bottle, Ollie? For our listeners who may not have witch bottles at home.
But maybe Mark should tell us that. He's the folklore. So
sure. Mark, what is a witch bottle?
So a witch bottle was a piece of apotropaic protection. So that's supernatural protection to prevent your home or other dwelling from incursion by witches or other sort of magical threats from outside. So it would be, in later times, a glass bottle, but originally a stone jar or a Bellarmine jar, and there are lots of examples in museums of these, which would be filled with urine, nails, pins, thorns, and other objects, and then generally concealed either in a hearth or on a threshold of the home. So it was to prevent a supernatural threat from outside by using a supernatural defense from inside.
So in some ways, and this is an example of sort of retrospective diagnosis, so it is somewhat problematic, but the argument was that witches, when they cross that threshold, if they then go to the toilet, because there's urine and pins in some of these bottles, that it might feel like they're peeing needles and pins. Actually, that's probably a reference to urinary tract infections. But again, a sort of bound up in an inherent misogyny in wider society that's connected through to witchcraft and protections and ideas about the evil eye. The other interesting museum object that I wanted to mention is actually in Cambridge in the Archaeology and Anthropology Museum, where they have a witch's broom that was collected by Margaret Murray. But it's tiny. it's not what you would imagine. It's not the kind of besom broom that you get in the collections of a museum like the Museum of English Rural Life. It's only about 6 or 7 inches long. So I don't quite understand what that object means and how it connects to these wider histories. But, there are these really interesting sort of examples of things that folklorists, even discredited or problematic folklorists, have collected or laid down as part of a wider set of records and archives and collections.
Yeah, and we need to remember as well, talking about Margaret Murray, of course, that she was only discredited in one area, as you say, and a lot of her work as an Egyptologist is still really valuable now too.
So that makes me think, Mark, a little bit more about what you were saying about borrowings and movements of ideas cross-culturally. So you're talking about trick-or-treating and American pumpkins, easier to carve, obviously, a bit more colourful than a British turnip or a Swede. So other reasons maybe why we have them too. But you've done some work on Scooby Doo. And I think that's a great sort of jumping off point for American ideas of folklore, but presumably within Scooby Doo as a sort of cartoon form, it's borrowing from lots of folkloric traditions. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. It borrows from cultures all over the world. I should probably clarify for those that don't know why I've done a lot of work on Scooby Doo. So I wrote a book which was published just over a year ago to the day, actually, as we're recording this, which looked at representations of folklore, mythology, the supernatural, the gothic, all of those elements in the show over its 50 plus years, and compares it to what we have in the real world in terms of folklore and mythology and all of those things. So where the show is accurate, where it's drawing on particular themes and ideas, and where it's obviously taking artistic license. And there's far more material than you would have thought possible in there about that sort of thing. And I mean, even the book itself, I guess, only scratches the surface in many ways. But yes, I mean, it does draw on all sorts of cultures. I mean, it starts off at the beginning, obviously, as being very based within America and rooted within the kind of social commentary and the ideas of the time. But then it does sort of stray into other areas, even within those early series. So it looks at Egyptology, but obviously it's within the confines of an American museum that has these objects. And then later on strays off into other countries and into other areas and draws on those cultures. But we do find commonalities between there and here. So, yeah, obviously the white-sheeted ghost is a very strong motif within folklore, for example, and one of the classic ones from the show. There's nary a social media post that talks about ghosts these days that doesn't have that particular animated GIF attached to it from the opening titles of the first season. So it does draw on these, not so much, I guess, folk practices at the beginning necessarily, although they do come in later on. We do find rural life and those kinds of aspects in later versions of the show, but certainly plenty of motifs from within our own folklore and that of other places around the world too.
So picking up on what you mentioned about apotropaic devices and objects, warding away evil spirits, I'm mindful that in Scooby Doo we see lots of monsters and lots of hauntings, but you don't see what people are doing to ward away those spirits that much, or do you? I mean, it seems like their solution is always to call in Scooby Doo the talking dog.
It's an unmasking, isn't it?
They want to unmask the force that's haunting them. You don't see how they're managing or trying to survive those forces in the way that we know for a fact rural communities were doing and very wary of.
That's certainly true at the beginning.
Right.
It's less true later on. So there are some very good examples, actually, where that does happen, and we do see those sorts of things. A prime example of that really is from an episode called To Switch a Witch. So the Ghost Witch of Old Salem.
That's a great name.
Name. There's always got to be a rhyme in there somewhere, or an exclamation mark.
Yeah.
So the monster is the Ghost Witch of Old Salem. So you've got two aspects there. She's a witch, but she's also a ghost. So the character is Melissa Wilcox in the show. She's said to have been a witch in Salem who was burned at the stake. The witches at Salem were never burned at the stake. It obviously draws on stereotypes. And then the gang go to investigate these issues around this town being haunted by the ghost of Melissa Wilcox. A part of which involves them looking at her grave. And on her grave, they find her name and the dates of her death and all of that sort of thing, but also an apotropaic mark carved into the gravestone. And they refer to that as a witch's mark, which is it's not a term we tend to use these days for those kinds of markings, but in terms of kind of common usage and common terminology, it's still quite frequently used. And it is exactly that. It's one of those marks that were put on buildings to give them protection from witches. Now, in terms of the show, they invent a fictionalized version of this. They say that this mark is the sign of Mormo. But even that feeds into these kinds of things because Mormo was a female spirit from Greek folklore. It was a spirit that acted as a bit of a kind of a bogey creature. So mothers or nurses who were looking after small children would use Mormo as a threat against bad behaviour. And then in terms of the show, it's pulling these little elements together and giving it a bit more veracity, but most people would not see it at all. So we do find these elements within there, and that's the kind of stuff that my work picks out from it, So, yeah, they do come up later.
It's really interesting. I profess I haven't watched Scooby Doo in a very long time. I think the most recent Scooby Doo I saw was probably rewatching the first Scooby Doo live action movie with my old classmate. But it's interesting thinking about these practices and I suppose examples of folk culture that date back centuries, if not far longer, that are now being replayed in modern America via Scooby Doo. And I'm thinking about all of the material traditions and objects that we associate with Halloween, some of which we've already referred to, whether that's turnips or pumpkins, old-fashioned candlelight, besom broomsticks, creaky floorboards with cobwebs, etc. These seem to have lots of links and overlaps with spaces that we traditionally think of as very rural or, places that you'd find in the countryside. Do you have a sense of why that is?
Well, I guess a lot of it is just it does play on those things that we find around us, and in an urbanized environment, arguably less so these days, but at the time, that was far less common. And also, of course, a lot of the people who were collecting folklore, folk tradition stories at this time, they're the educated people who are coming from those urban environments into the rural backwaters where everybody still believes all this superstitious nonsense. A lot of the folklore we have collected around that time is tarred with that brush. The idea that the rural classes, the people who are living in the country and have these strange ideas about the things that they find around them, they're the uneducated folk, and how could they possibly believe these things in this kind of enlightened 19th, 20th century environment? And so we find those sorts of connections there. The idea that people use what is around them and make do with what is around them and put them to all these sorts of different uses. I guess that's got a lot to do with it.
On the point of, people not believing these superstitious rural folk, I suppose that's what sets Scooby, Shaggy and the crew of the Mystery Machine apart, that they believe these people and they help them. There's something in that that's quite nice. There's a dignity in it, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so. And we find later on in the show that a lot of the kind of rural elements that you'd recognise from the collections at the Merle and what you're representing there, they start to pop up in the show later on in what we might call the kind of rural uncanny that you're talking about here. So there are some episodes that do that. There's an episode from the new Scooby Doo movies called The Fricket Fracas, where the ghost is a scarecrow, for example. And in the same episode, we have this kind of traditional old mill as part of the landscape there as well. And mills are really charged with supernatural ideas in terms of this as well. That's a really old idea. It stems from the development process of the mill, because the machinery allowed something that was done by hand to then become autonomous. But obviously, where you used to do your own grinding of corn and you understood how the process worked, when you went to the mill, you just put a product in at one end and then something magically different comes out at the other end. And there's no human intervention there. So there's got to be something magical going on. And we find this idea then being ascribed to the workings of the mill. Is it some kind of intervention by fairies how does stuff work, and then that idea transitions over time to the idea of the haunted mill, so fairies become ghosts in that way. There's another episode actually earlier on, the second season of the original version, Where Are You? There's an episode called Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Werewolf? That has a haunted mill in it as well. So there's this smuggling operation going on in this mill where they're smuggling sheep. And the sheep are packed up in barrels and floated down the river. It's very Tolkien-esque, I know. But so we have these aspects as well. So rural smuggling. Yeah, rural smuggling of sheep, the haunted mill. So actually, even early on, you do find these kind of rural elements in there.
So this reminds me, Mark, of one of your other books, the Telling the Bees and Other Customs, the Folklore of Rural Crafts, which I think came out in 2020. So you would have been promoting and sharing ideas about that book just as the pandemic was underway. In that book, you obviously pick up on a number of different aspects of rural craft or traditional practices. There's often in those narratives, from what I remember from the book, the tension between old and new technologies and ways of doing things. And as those transitions happen, as you're explaining in relation to milling, ideas get built up around the new practices, but also you've got these vestiges of the old practices. There seems to be a lot in that around folklore as well, that we're talking about folklore emerging at a time when there were slowly becoming more people in towns and cities than there were in the countryside. That idea of the countryside itself emerges at that point in time. It's sort of peripheralizing, and it's making rural people into the backwater, but they haven't been prior to that. So I think there's something interesting in that.
It's very much an idea that's ascribed by the people from the urban environment or from the richer areas or from the higher classes, this idea of the country folk being in a rural backwater and therefore having these kinds of less enlightened ideas. Because you need to remember that it wasn't very many years prior to that if the people who came from those higher classes or urban environments were sick and needed help, they'd go and find the healers and the people who were knowledgeable about plants and folk medicine and all of those kinds of things in precisely those rural backwaters that they then start to ascribe those ideas to later on.
So some of those social tensions, I guess, are really fertile breeding grounds for cultural practice and cultural ideas to both emerge and sort of become consolidated. This reminds me of the conversations we had with Katrina Navikas in previous episodes about rural protests. So it's worth going back to those and maybe reflecting on the moment when the Luddites were smashing up equipment or swing rioters were doing the same. Different kind of responses to those moments of change. But when it comes to folklore, I think we've also got something else going on. You've got these really interesting, certainly with earlier folklorists, you've already referenced the degree to which Scooby Doo might borrow from Egyptology, or that folklorists were also studying other parts of the world. This makes me think again about a set of collections in another university museum. And again, I'm taking us back to the Archaeology and Anthropology Museum in Cambridge, which became the repository for some of the earliest folklore society collections. So this is British folklorists collecting and amassing stuff to do with folk practice. But they also collected and amassed a very large collection of material from a man called Frederick Starr, Mexican Day of the Dead material. And the Day of the Dead, of course, is another of those traditions globally that has an overlap with Halloween. It's not quite the same. It's much more on the sort of celebration of ancestors side of things. But I think there's something quite resonant in that early folklorists were very interested in all of these other practices from around the world, as well as in their own culture, and drawing parallels, sometimes quite problematic ones. Do you think that comes through in Scooby Doo? Do you think it comes through in contemporary Halloween? How do you feel as a contemporary folklorist looking at those things that are cross-cultural? Because we're obviously still borrowing. We're far more likely to have someone dressed as Donald Trump on the doorstep and trying to ward them off with sweets than we are to have someone wearing a sheet dressed as a ghost and trying to ward them off with a witch's bottle.
I think it's a difficult area to examine and to work in, to be honest, because we have to not lose sight of the fact that Halloween particularly is a time that's connected with mischief in one respect, of course, but then also a time for having fun, and the dressing up and the guising elements and all those sorts of things are very much a big part of that. But more and more so recently, I think we need to be wary of where that transitions the line from simply having fun to tricky cultural appropriation. And we see this more and more now with museum collections as well, and with items being repatriated and so on. It's very difficult to repatriate a part of intangible cultural heritage once it moves elsewhere. And I think the Day of the Dead is a prime example of that. Because the alphanique, for example, so that's the sugar paste skulls that you see on altars in Mexico and things like that, very much part of this ancestor worship and celebration. We then see in shops as just, a cool treat that you can have as Halloween. And maybe you can argue the case that, yes, a skull is a skull. But then we get these other things where we get companies organising big Mexican Day of the Dead style street parties for no reason other than it's a cool theme to have a party around and they can make a good profit off the ticket money from it. And then it becomes slightly more tricky because what we find a good theme for a party, that the people who use those aspects in their own day-to-day life and belief systems and worship and how, depending on what it is, however you look at it, are going to view that in a very different way. So I think there's a tricky line there between the two. It's another liminal boundary.
I suppose the costume that these people are putting on is someone else's cultural, religious practice, isn't it? That's the... Yeah.
There are different kinds of objects and things that are being repatriated, I guess, but very much First Nations costumes, Native American, American Indian, whichever term you need to use depending on what the item is, headdresses and things like that, which are being put back into the cultures from where they were collected originally. They have that religious significance to them that arguably means that that's where they should be.
Just going back once more to Scooby Doo, I'm reminded that a lot of the times the kind of spooky forces or the monsters in Scooby Doo, at least from childhood memory, do relate to other cultures. So there's mummies running around, you get all kinds of things. I'm sure there are examples of poorly handled indigenous cultures being adopted by these forces that then later are revealed to be someone in disguise. I'm remembering the Scooby Doo movie as well, the one with Rowan Atkinson. I think there's a lot in there that's quite dubious cultural appropriation on an island that is specifically themed around that. Is there a significance of that in Scooby Doo, of how these sinister forces and monsters are also being linked to other cultures?
I don't think there's a negative narrative being told there as to this particular culture is a bad influence because they're then represented. Every culture is represented in some way as a villain at some point. But the point is, it always turns out, well, at least 95% of the time, because there are versions of the show where the supernatural is deemed to be real, and that's a whole separate discussion point.
That would be a separate podcast, I think. That would
it definitely would. It definitely would. Yeah. In all the kind of, the canonical versions of the show where the villain is unmasked at the end, the villain is a human being. The villain isn't anything monstrous or anything linked to a particular culture in that way. The message at the end of the day is the monsters are us as people. It's that kind of social commentary. You do find, though, that some cultures are represented in far fewer episodes than others. American Indian, Native American cultures are really ones that don't come up very often. And I think the reason for that is that even in the 1960s, when the show first emerges, those tensions are already there between the indigenous cultures and the white American cultures as to what has happened. And you have to remember at the end of the day that Scooby Doo is intended to be a comedy. And it's very difficult to interject humour into those kinds of tricky aspects of cross-cultural shifts and narratives. So they tend to shy away from those. And where they do use them, they tend to be done in a fairly respectful or at least non-cultural way.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just to your point, and go back to the Mexican Day of the Dead parties, that's essentially what the villains in Scooby Doo are often doing. they are people who are dressing up in the costumes of other cultures for some sort of intended effect.
They are, that's true.
Yeah.
Normally nefarious. Yeah.
Normally nefarious, yeah.
From what I remember, they often turn out to be local, slightly failing market capitalists as well. So maybe there's a subtext of social commentary going on there about other aspects of change over time. And thinking about that, this idea of particularly local legends, myths, traditions comes through very strongly in the series. It's often picking up, as you say, in the Salem context. It's picking up on those Salem witch histories. Rural places often harbour these rich traditions, and I'm sure all three of us and all of our listeners would be able to recount examples of this from their own local communities and environments. Are there any particularly interesting local traditions from where you're joining us from, Mark, that you can tell us about? I mean, I know that you've written about regional lore and myths and legends as well.
Well, I mean, any area of the country or any area of the world has its own myths and legends. There are certainly plenty where I am. So I'm down in the southwest of the UK. So I live in Devon and fairly close to Dartmoor. In fact, I'm halfway between Dartmoor and Exmoor. So that's two big areas of national park. Devon, of course, on the southwest peninsula, very much one of those uneducated rural backwaters that we've been discussing.
You're a counterpoint to that, Mark. Clearly, you're proving that wrong.
It's also worth quickly pointing out that on the topic of Exmoor, the absolute unit sheep that gives this podcast its name is an Exmoor horn.
Yeah, with its own sort of contemporary mythology being built up around it, I guess. But yeah, sorry, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there are plenty of kind of local myths and legends that we could draw on, whether they're ghosts or mysterious animals or whatever. But I guess thinking about what we've already talked about and tensions in the countryside and things like that, you mentioned protest early on as part of this episode, and that kind of ties in as well. So on Dartmoor has a number of tors, granite tors, which make up its landscape. One of which is Crockern Tor, and Crockern Tor was the location of the old Stannery Parliament. So Dartmoor used to be mined for tin many years ago. It was a very big part of the landscape here because Dartmoor is notoriously difficult to farm. So you get livestock.
Is a tor just a hill? Is a tor a hill, or is that?
Yes, essentially. Yeah. So you get livestock on Dartmoor. You don't get arable so much because if you think about, if you've seen the movie version of Warhorse, it kind of opens with them trying to plough an impossibly difficult field and it's just picking stones out of it. That was shot at Sheep's Tor on Dartmoor, and that's pretty much what it looks like all of the time. So it was mined for tin as a very big part of its industry, and the Stannery Parliament used to meet on Crockern Tor. So these were representatives from the 4 different parliaments where mining was happening on the moor. But Crockern Tor was also, according to myth and legend, the home of Old Crockern. And Old Crockern is an interesting character in terms of legend because there are kind of a couple of different aspects to Old Crockern. One is this idea of a figure riding a skeletal horse with kind of skeletal phantom hounds, which are kept at Wisman's Wood, which is nearby to Old Crockern, a very old ancient oak forest on the moor. But the other aspect of Old Crockern is that Old Crockern represents Dartmoor itself. So it's the guardian spirit of the moor. Old Crockern is the spirit of the moor. So there was a case on Dartmoor a few years ago where a wealthy landowner purchased part of the moor and won a legal case which overturned the right to wild camp on Dartmoor, essentially. There was a lot of press about this and a lot of unhappiness from those people who use the moor for all sorts of different ways, because Dartmoor was the only place left where you could wild camp legally. So there was a lot of public outcry about this. Right to Roam and these sorts of organisations got very heavily involved, and they used Old Crockern as a symbol for their protest. So they created a giant version of Old Crockern, which was worn as a costume giants in folklore and folk procession are very common, and this kind of drew on that and was kind of the centerpiece of their protests really as well.
Definitely fits in with the conversations that we had with Katrina Navikas about the commons and about rights of access and the sort of complexities of those over time.
I actually think almost all of the podcasts we've done have touched on land use and management and commons and access at various points. It's almost like I could play bingo with these episodes and when that comes up, because it is just such a essential part of contemporary discussions around landscape.
And it's a theme that we come back to time and time again over the history of rural England, because it's such a tension between people who own or make decisions about land and rural space and those who operate within, work within, live within, use those spaces.
And it does strike me that is also something that happens in Scooby Doo quite often, where you'll have people who are being, like they'll be the occupants, the inhabitants of a space, who are being terrorized by someone who's trying to get them out. I'm casting I couldn't name episodes, but I'm casting my memory back, and I'm sure that comes up several times, that it's a kind of
many times
a haunting that's all to do with land access and ownership.
Yes, yeah, on lots of occasions. But the interesting thing about Old Crockern as a central figure within protest is that it doesn't represent any one person or any one organisation in that way. The people who are protesting are not represented by Old Crockern. Old Crockern is representative of the moor itself, of the land itself. So therefore the central figure is not ridiculing anybody. It's not representing any one person. The stakes are around the moor, and as the guardian of the moor, this symbol of Old Crockern is kind of the perfect symbol for protest in this case, really.
Just going back to what we said at the beginning about folklore being almost untraceable in its origins, do we know where Old Crockern came from? Did he just come from Crockern Tor itself?
Yes, it comes out of the location, but there is no one origin story that says, oh yes, it developed in this way.
Yeah.
So the figure, the sort of costume figure that you're talking about, Mark, that was made for those Right to Roam or the Stars Are For Everyone campaigns, the Dartmoor Rising campaigns, was made by a group called the Lost Giants, who centre this kind of practice on reimagining folk monsters, characters, creatures, manifestations from historic folklore, and using those as a vehicle for engagement around some of these nature, access, important contemporary themes. Hopefully, Old Crockern might be paying us a visit here at the Merle next year, so watch this space, and maybe watch the spaces out and about around the Merle as well, because Old Crockern will have to get here somehow. So fingers crossed, we'll be welcoming the spirit of Crockern Tor of Dartmoor here to maybe represent some of those issues in a more visible way in the heart of Reading.
And do you think we can?
Yeah, he certainly gets about. We as the Folklore Library and Archive loaned a number of objects to the Museum of Dartmoor Life in Oakhampton for their special exhibition last year, 2024, which was around myth and legend on Dartmoor, and they had Old Crockern in that gallery as well as part of that exhibition. So yeah, he's well used to standing in museums.
Ollie, do you think we can get Crockern on the podcast?
We could try. we might be more successful in getting one of the people, the activists involved in the protests who worked alongside Old Crockern. So I wonder about possibly Nick Hayes, who actually illustrated Old Crockern riding on that skeletal horse and as part of that wider Dartmoor Rising campaign. Or perhaps maybe someone from the Lost Giants. So
yeah,
we'll get someone to talk about these wider campaigns and issues and conversations, even if Old Crockern remains, quietly silent about it all.
Brilliant. Mark, for listeners who aren't aware, would you tell us a little bit about the Folklore Library and Archive?
Yes, so the Folklore Library and Archive is a charity. It's registered with the Charity Commission, whose constitutional aim is to try and collect and preserve folklore and folklore adjacent materials, and we have a special focus on what we would call at-risk heritage. So this is often items that come from people's personal collections, or items for which there has been no provision made on death, for example, and they become at risk that way. And also, crucially, then, to make those materials available for free for the public good through open access, whether that's through digitisation, whether it's through visiting and looking at the materials, looking at our print library, our reference library, or so on. So I formed the Folklore Library and Archive 4 years ago now, really off the back of my podcast, the Folklore Podcast. And that really came about because during lockdown, publishers sent me an awful lot of books for review or for feature, because that's the way a lot of things happened at that time. So this kind of really useful reference library of folklore materials was being generated through that. And I thought, well, this is something that should really be something else. And that was the seed that then grew into what is now the Folklore Library and Archive. We registered as a charity 2 years ago to enable us to go grant application route and to partner on other projects, which we've done very successfully. So we're currently partners on the National Folklore Survey for England. We were partners on another funded project last year, which looked at diversity and inclusion within folklore. So that's what the charity does. So we have collections which really cover all formats. So there's a print reference library, document archives. So one of the first at-risk collections which we acquired were the document archives of the late Venetia Newell. Venetia was an Anglo-American folklorist, past president of the Folklore Society, the world's leading expert on decorated eggs. So
we
all of her
we have a few of her eggs in the Merrill collection, actually, just a small number. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Most are in the British Museum. Some are at Pitt Rivers, I believe, as well, and some at the Merle. But her document archives, nothing ever happened to those. They ended up being placed on the open market, and we knew that they were at risk of being split and wanted to try and save those. So we had a big crowdfunding campaign to raise the money to save those, and that was the first kind of major thing that we acquired. We also have, from my own personal collections, but now in the Folklore Library and Archive, the UK's primary collection of materials related to spectral black dogs and apparitions of black dogs in the countryside, which was the subject of my first book, and many, many other things, video, audio, artifacts, and so on.
So thinking about weird and wonderful sightings of strange and terrifying beasts, so black dogs and their ilk, Mark, I wonder whether you can recount any particular examples from that work or from your book on the subject that connect to farms and rural sightings of black dogs.
There are plenty. We could spend hours listing a whole load of them. I guess one that comes immediately to mind, because it was not too far away from me, was quite an interesting example of a black dog which was recorded as having startled a farmer who was drawing a cart, so horse and cart, along a country lane. And this mysterious black dog appears from behind the hedgerow, but is strange because it walks on its hind legs rather than being on all fours, and this terrifies the horse, which then sort of shoots off up the road with the cart and so on. So that's one example. There are loads of them.
That sounds like an excellent excuse for losing a cart and horse.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Speaking of haunted dogs, and especially like bipedal dogs, this reminds me a lot of the latest book by folkloric author, would you say, Ollie? Folkloric author Tom Cox?
Definitely folklore adjacent, folklore inspired.
Whose new book, Everything Will Swallow You, features a man leading a rural life with a quaint bipedal companion. Yeah. And we're going to be bringing Tom on the podcast very soon to talk about the book. So we're very, very excited for that.
Lots of cool stuff coming up.
Yeah.
This feels like a perfect moment to segue into our own liminal period between this podcast and perhaps other ones. So we're hoping to welcome you back in relatively short notice, Mark, and hopefully we'll dig deeper into this process of collecting, how you establish a new institution, because you're a very new institution, the Folklore Library and Archive. We've been kicking around for almost 75 years here at the Merrill, so, interesting comparisons there about studying folk culture. Please come back. Please share more about the library and archive, and thank you so much. It's been a brilliant conversation.
It's been brilliant chatting with you. Yeah.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Mark, for joining us, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. I've been Joe Vaughan.
And I've been Ollie Douglas.
We keep getting this wrong.
And I still am Ollie Douglas.
You are Ollie Douglas,
still
though.
Joe
Yeah,
Vaughan.
but we used to have a better way of doing this, but I forgot what it was. What did we say?
But does that matter?
I don't think it does matter.
No.
We hope you've listened.
We hope you've listened.
We hope you've listened. We hope you've gotten to this point. We hope you've enjoyed the episode. We release every 2 weeks, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with someone else about rural history. There'll probably be less Scooby Doo.
And slightly less than 2 weeks, because this is like a special episode.
This is a special episode. Yeah, we'll be back in 13 days. Can you believe it?
That's a spooky number.
It's a spooky number, isn't it? It's an appropriate number.
Yeah, scary.
Yeah.
And we'll be back with Mark Norman at a future date, where we'll be talking about the Folklore Library and Archive in greater detail and depth, and how that relates to the foundation of the Merrill and to other ways of collecting the rural worlds around us.
We'll look forward to catching up with you then.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Is that a spooky goodbye?